Stalin's most feared enforcer, met a terrifying end. Moscow, winter 1953. Snow settles quietly over a city that has learned to survive in silence. For decades, fear had ruled the Soviet Union, enforced not only by ideology, but by one man who understood power better than anyone else behind the Iron Curtain. He was not a general on the battlefield, nor a revolutionary with a loud voice. He operated in shadows, signing papers that determined who lived, who disappeared, and who would never be spoken of again. For years, his name alone was enough to make even senior officials lower their voices. Millions suffered under a system he perfected with ruthless efficiency. Yet history has a way of turning executioners into prisoners. When the man who once decided the fate of others was finally stripped of protection, there would be no mercy waiting for him. This is the story of Lavrenti Beria, how terror elevated him, how power corrupted him, and how the system he built ultimately destroyed him. In the chaotic years following the Bolshevik takeover, Beria entered the Soviet security services, institutions designed not to uphold justice, but to eliminate perceived threats to the state. He quickly distinguished himself as methodical, disciplined, and unsentimental. Where others hesitated, Beria acted. He gathered intelligence, organized surveillance networks, and oversaw arrests with administrative efficiency. His rise was especially rapid in Georgia, where resistance to Soviet rule remained strong. Beria played a central role in suppressing nationalist movements, leaving behind a legacy of fear that caught the attention of Moscow. That attention soon came from Joseph Stalin himself. Both men were Georgian, but more importantly, both understood power in similar terms. Stalin valued results above morality, and Beria delivered. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Beria consolidated control over regional security structures, proving his usefulness during forced collectivization campaigns. Villages were broken apart, families displaced, and dissent crushed. Beria did not question policy. He enforced it, and that made him indispensable. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union entered a period defined by paranoia and mass repression. Stalin, convinced that enemies surrounded him, launched what became known as the Great Purge. When Beria was appointed head of the NKVD in 1938, he inherited an already brutal system and refined it further. Under his leadership, repression became more centralized and more efficient. Arrests were often based on fabricated accusations, but paperwork was meticulous. Confessions were extracted, sentences processed, and lives erased with bureaucratic precision. Executions numbered in the hundreds of thousands, while millions more were sent into the vast forced labor camp network. Beria understood that fear was most effective when it felt unavoidable. Anyone could become a target, regardless of loyalty or past service. This uncertainty kept the population obedient and the political elite silent. Beria also ensured that detailed records existed for everyone, especially his colleagues. Files became his insurance policy, protecting him from rivals and binding others to his fate. The outbreak of the Second World War expanded Beria's authority even further. He oversaw internal security, counterintelligence, and wartime discipline. Soldiers and civilians alike were monitored for signs of disloyalty or defeatism. Entire ethnic groups were accused of collaboration and forcibly relocated across vast distances. These deportations were carried out with speed and coordination, often giving families little time to prepare. Transport conditions were severe, and many did not survive the journey. To Beria, such losses were operational outcomes, not moral concerns. At the same time, Beria's influence reached into one of the most consequential projects of the 20th century, the Soviet nuclear program. Stalin placed him in charge not because of scientific expertise, but because Beria knew how to enforce deadlines and extract results. Scientists worked under constant surveillance, aware that failure carried severe consequences. Intelligence networks gathered information from abroad, while domestic resources were mobilized at immense human cost. When the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic device in 1949, Beria's position appeared stronger than ever. Yet, behind closed doors, fear followed him everywhere. Even senior officials spoke carefully in his presence. Beria maintained control by cultivating uncertainty and reminding others of what he knew about them. Rumors circulated about personal abuses of power, but no one dared investigate a man so closely tied to Stalin. His authority was not rooted in popularity or ideology, but in his command of fear. Everything changed in March 1953 with Stalin's sudden death. The system Beria had helped enforce now lacked its central figure. Sensing opportunity, Beria moved quickly. He presented himself as a reformer, announcing prisoner releases and proposing policy shifts that suggested a softer direction for the Soviet Union. To some, it seemed like a genuine transformation. To others, it was a calculated maneuver to consolidate power. Members of the Soviet leadership understood the danger. They knew Beria's history, his methods, and the reach of his security apparatus. If he succeeded, none of them would be safe. Quietly, they formed an alliance, securing support from key military figures who could counter Beria's institutional advantages. The plan required precision and secrecy. Delay meant risk. In June 1953, Beria was summoned to what he believed was a routine meeting of the leadership. Instead, he was confronted with accusations ranging from abuse of power to treason. Before he could rally his supporters, armed officers entered the room and placed him under arrest. The reversal was swift and absolute. The man who had orchestrated countless detentions was now a prisoner himself. Beria was held in isolation as investigators assembled their case. Some charges were exaggerated or politically convenient, but many were supported by documentation bearing his signature. The trial, conducted in secrecy, offered no meaningful defense. The outcome was predetermined. The system that had once protected him now required his removal. In December 1953, the sentence was carried out. Beria was executed, his remains disposed of without ceremony. His name was removed from official narratives, photographs altered, and records revised. The state moved quickly to erase his presence, as if doing so could undo the past. But the consequences of Beria's actions could not be erased. Communities destroyed, families broken, and trust shattered remained long after his death. His story stands as a stark example of how systems built on fear eventually consume those who operate them. Beria believed power would shield him indefinitely. Instead, it isolated him, and when the balance shifted, it left him with nothing. Lavrenti Beria believed power would protect him forever. He mastered fear, weaponized bureaucracy, and served tyranny with precision. For years, the system rewarded him. Yet in the end, the very machinery he built turned against him without hesitation. His story is not just about one man, but about what happens when institutions abandon morality in favor of control. Beria did not act alone. He thrived because the system demanded people like him. And when he was no longer useful, that same system discarded him without remorse. History remembers Beria not for reform, not for achievement, but as a warning. Absolute power, when divorced from accountability, consumes both victims and perpetrators. And even those who seem untouchable are never beyond judgment. If stories like this matter to you, consider reflecting on the lessons they leave behind, because forgetting them is how they repeat.